Hi everyone, two quick things before the video starts today. One, this was filmed over the course of 2 days, so there are some changes in continuity and clothing halfway through the list. Also, my microphone was constantly malfunctioning throughout the filming of this video, so the audio will switch sometimes between the audio from my camera and the audio from the microphone. So sorry for that inconsistency, and I will try to get that fixed as soon as possible. Enjoy the video, everyone.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the Okayest Computer YouTube channel. My name is Patrick, and today we're going to be talking about Phil Elverum and ranking his 15 studio albums from worst to best. Phil Elverum is a singer, songwriter, multi-instrumentalist, producer, and visual artist born in Washington. He released 4 studio albums with his band The Microphones between 1996 and 2003, followed by 17 years worth of solo albums under the name Mount Eerie, and then a surprise Microphones comeback album in 2020. I can confidently say I am obsessed with Phil's music. I have been listening to him constantly for several years now, I own much of his discography, and I've devoted plenty of Instagram content to his music as well. If you know me, you know I love Phil's work. The work of Mount Eerie and the Microphones has been labeled as indie rock, experimental, noise rock, electronic, folk, the list goes on. The man has no genre, and that's part of what makes his many albums so thrilling to listen to. It also makes it very difficult to rank them from worst to best, since all of them are drastically different, and all of them are very good. But of course, there has to be one that comes in last place, so let's get started with number 15. At the bottom of the list is Ocean Roar, released in 2012, 3 months after his album Clear Moon. Both Ocean Roar and Clear Moon were recorded in the same sessions, but they were released as separate albums, so they will be separated on this list. Following the release of 2 astounding acoustic records, Dawn and Lost Wisdom, Phil made a conscious effort to make bigger and louder albums that combined his classic noise rock sound with a lot of input from ambient drones and synthesizers. The resulting albums were pretty weird. Ocean Roar isn't a bad album, but it had Phil venturing into very unusual sounds, and as a result, he didn't really know what he wanted it to sound like. He would go on to improve this ambient rock style with the album Sauna, but for now we're left with a series of dramatic, noisy vignettes with little to no vocals. No, I'm not exaggerating, this album is almost entirely instrumental. The man with an instantly recognizable voice and the capability to produce stunning vocal harmonies made an album where he is vocally absent for most of the runtime. I like the instrumentals that Phil recorded here, but listening to Ocean Roar feels like hearing a song's introduction, and then they just play the introduction for 5 more minutes. There are some moments where Phil briefly sings, like on the song Waves or the penultimate track I Walked Home Beholding. These are the only 2 times that Phil can actually be heard. Any other case of vocals is completely drowned out by super loud guitars and wild drums. His vocal performances that are actually audible are some of the only moments of clarity and relief on the album, and the rest of it is just kinda there. If you're into the black metal tendencies of Wind's Poem, or the meandering ambient tracks of Sauna, you might find this album interesting, but for the most part, Ocean Roar is lacking a lot of the core components of Phil's music, and it really suffers as a result. Lost Wisdom Part 2, released in 2019, is the second album recorded by the duo of Phil Elverum and Julie Doiron. For their second album together, the two decided to record another very calm and meditative acoustic record, just like their first, only this time the lyrics are centered around the death of Phil's wife. This was also the central topic of albums A Crow Looked at Me and Now Only, and 3 albums after her death, Phil is still grieving and figuring out how to move on. There was also his divorce with Michelle Williams that adds even more bleakness to the lyrics of this album. Phil's process of slowly picking up the pieces and recovering from these 2 separate losses leads to an album that is a lot more restrained than the rambling of Now Only, and slightly less devastating than A Crow Looked at Me. The album was recorded in Phil's home with his doors open so as to capture the sounds of his surroundings as he sang. While additional input from birds or construction workers is very infrequent, the additional aesthetic of the outdoors and of nature makes for a very creative atmosphere. However, the weight of Phil's personal struggles and the creative recording technique is about all the album has going for it. That's not to say it's a failure, it's a decent collection of acoustic songs, but it feels so bland in comparison to his other 2 grief-related records. The instrumentation here is fine, I guess. Soft guitars and hushed, vulnerable vocals are nothing new in Phil's music. Some of his finest records are built upon those two elements. But even his quietest, most repetitive acoustic songs find a way to be emotionally potent within the lyrics. On the contrary, Lost Wisdom Part 2 does not pack that emotional punch. It just feels like vague observations on general sadness, completely lacking the impeccable songwriting that made A Crow Looked at Me and Now Only so effective. The only track here that's truly memorable is the song Widows. Now, granted, that is one of my favorite songs of his, but that's because it is loud, dynamic, and very emotional, unlike the rest of the album. It also doesn't overstay its welcome like the song Belief, which is so long it has to be split into two parts. Lost Wisdom Part 2 sees Phil continuing to channel his grief into music with surprisingly mediocre results. It's a good indie folk album by most artists' standards, but it is a lot less compelling and a lot more monotonous than the previous Lost Wisdom album. And here we have the other half of that double album, Clear Moon. I feel like Phil definitely had a goal in mind when he made both of these 2012 albums, but Clear Moon is the one that actually succeeds. A lot of the things I said about Ocean Roar also apply here, but what makes this one really stand out is the solid vocal performances. Ocean Roar was missing that key ingredient, so now the pummeling distortion and intense ambient synthesizers are balanced out with epic vocal harmonies. Instead of feeling like a series of stagnant instrumentals, now the songs are a lot more fully developed and a lot more riveting as a result. Still, it does place relatively low on the list since a lot of the songs are very unsatisfying interludes, and some of the tracks start off very nice but then drag on way too long, the worst offender being the ballad The Place I Live. The only song that really impresses me start to finish is the title track, which weirdly enough is the longest song on the album. The instrumentation constantly changes and evolves, becoming very grand and dramatic in the second half, and the vocal harmonies are consistently gorgeous. It is quite excessive, but it is expertly crafted. So yeah, Clear Moon, though relatively unremarkable, is definitely the superior half of the 2012 duo. Those of you who want something really dynamic and riveting and memorable should probably look elsewhere, but anyone looking for a short and casual listen will probably think it's pretty good. Don't Wake Me Up was the first studio album by the Microphones and also the first studio album by Phil in general. While it does place quite low on the list, I still have the utmost respect for this album, and it is a very important landmark for Phil as an artist. Don't Wake Me Up is a case of a debut album that's very promising, but it's very, very messy, and they don't quite have things figured out yet. The ideas delivered on this album are very creative and enjoyable, as with all of Phil's albums, but the demo quality recording and the very confusing, disorienting song structures lead to an album that's a lot better in concept than in execution. Take, for example, the song Florida Beach. It has the ability to be a very solid track, but there are multiple things weighing it down, the most obvious being a sudden interpolation of Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys. This is one of the only known cases of Phil intentionally using another artist's lyrics. It's really, really off-putting when he suddenly drops this 6-second sample into an otherwise traditional noise rock track. This is one of the only known cases of Phil intentionally using another artist's lyrics, and so having this 6-second snippet of Good Vibrations dropped into a crazy noise track is really, really confusing.
Also, the song Sweetheart Sleep Tight is very atmospheric and bizarre and could potentially be a great interlude, but the horns and the accordions are mixed so loudly and compressed so heavily that they are horribly clipping and constantly fluctuating in volume. It adds a very messy sound to an otherwise okay song. The songs I'll Be in the Air and You'll Be in the Air introduce a musical motif that would appear a lot in the band's later work, especially on The Glow Part 2. The input from vocalist Mira adds a lot to the themes of separation and loneliness on the album. Those are two songs that I highly, highly recommend. While I do hold a lot of respect for the bold instrumentation and emotionally heavy songwriting on Don't Wake Me Up, it feels more like a blueprint for a good Microphones album rather than an actual good Microphones album. While there is a lot happening here that I really, really like, they don't really go on to perfect that sound until their later records.
Sauna feels very much like a transitional album for Phil. He had just gotten done with a very ambitious double album, and he had yet to experience the string of tragedies that would inspire his next trilogy of albums. There wasn't a clear motivation or creative vision that inspired the music of Sauna, and as a result, Phil was able to roam free and create a new album completely from scratch. This does make the album feel quite inconsistent, since through its hour-long runtime, it does occasionally feel slightly bloated or aimless, like these acoustic and ambient tracks wander the sonic landscape with minimal purpose. That general lack of focus is the primary reason Sauna lands in the bottom 5, but there is a lot of great material here that should not be overlooked. This was definitely the most traditional record Phil had made in years. There were no black metal detours, no extravagant linear storylines, no bone-chilling winter atmosphere, just classic Phil. Those of you looking for bare necessities Mount Eerie could easily go to No Flashlight or Lost Wisdom, but Sauna will also meet those needs. The lyrics here are very simply written, with tracks devoted to boats, and pumpkins, and dragons, and books. Very mundane and simple concepts that Phil is able to spin into fully fleshed out stories. They're all backed with very spacey keyboard arrangements, some very nice contributions from backing vocalists, and drums that are more atmospheric than they are rhythmic. And that's really all there is to say about Sauna. Like I said, this is a very normal and uncomplicated album by Phil's standards. That's not an insult, though. It may be lacking daring musicianship or crazy creative risks, but Phil does what he typically does, and he does it very well. This is a great introduction to a lot of Phil's signature sounds, and I would highly recommend it for a first-time listener. Phil Elverum in 2018 was not at his best. Here we have a man in serious pain, who has just lost someone that he loves very much, and has poured all of his emotions and his words into this masterpiece of an album, leaving him slightly more at peace, but still very much empty inside. Where does he go from here? Well, he makes Now Only, an album that proves he is still suffering, but is slowly working to put the pieces of his life back together. Now Only is a companion album to A Crow Looked at Me that focuses less on his wife's death and more on the life that they had together. This is a collection of 6 songs and stories that goes through their life, their relationship, what made her so important to him, and ultimately, what made her death hurt so much. Due to the stream of consciousness storytelling of the record, the songs are quite lengthy. The lead single, Distortion, hits a staggering 11 minutes. A lot of the storytelling on this album may just come across as rambling to some listeners, and Phil's monotonous voice make it any more invigorating, hence the low placement on the list. But the saving grace of this album, and what makes it a suitable companion to A Crow Looked at Me, is that the collection of stories Phil is telling, despite their underwhelming delivery, are fascinating. The aforementioned single, Distortion, is also my favorite song on the album despite its absurd length. It is a heart-wrenching confessional piece in which Phil speaks directly to his wife about the events that have shaped his life up to her death. It begins and ends with 2 landmark moments in Phil's life, the 2 times that he saw a dead body. The first time was his great-grandfather, and the other time was his wife. It's a wonderful concept for a song, and although it is very lengthy by Mount Eerie standards, it is flawlessly executed. Another highlight is the song Crow Part 2, a continuation of a song from A Crow Looked at Me. Like with the first one, this song sees Phil comparing his wife to different aspects of nature, as well as describing in excruciating detail the impact that her death had on his life and that of his daughter. There is also a spontaneous reference to an older song of his, Lost Wisdom, an interesting callback to when he interpolated the moon on the Crow track Soria Moria. The album ends with Phil saying he will reach through to the world of the gone with his hand empty, a chilling and devastating way to end the song and the album. Now Only may not be as intimate, poignant, or concise as the record that preceded it, but the series of tales Phil tells are a wonderful expansion of his previous ideas that offer a lot of further insight into what made his wife's death so significant to him. Despite occasional production flaws and a much less restrained runtime than A Crow Looked at Me, I am so happy that Phil was able to successfully make an album detailing his journey of recovering from grief. Microphones in 2020, released in 2020, is Phil's most recent studio album to date, and the first in 17 years to be released under the Microphones moniker. After 17 years of no Microphones, I was very excited to see what exactly Phil would be doing with this spontaneous comeback album. What we ended up getting was 45 continuous minutes of music detailing the entire history of the microphones, from Phil recording his first demos up until the release of the album that we're listening to. It is highly inaccessible, and that's being generous. Sitting down and listening to this whole thing is not an easy task, and that's coming from a guy that makes ambient music. But those who choose to brave through the absurdly long instrumental passages and pseudo-spoken word paragraphs will find that this album is actually very interesting and very fulfilling. Honestly, this is the only album on the list that I can't really give an in-depth analysis of, because it is literally just acoustic guitars and Phil telling his entire life story. That's it. And it's not perfect, hence the middle of the list ranking. It is insanely long, and while the song is consistently interesting to me, opening your song with 7 consecutive minutes of 2 repeating guitar chords is not the right way to reel in listeners. Also, the melody rarely changes, so that's another thing that a lot of people might not like. But those of you who follow my Instagram saw that I rated this as one of my favorite albums of 2020, and I stand by that opinion. I think Phil's masterful storytelling abilities are on full display here, and his decision to describe the entire history of this brilliant band in meticulous detail is something that only Phil Elverum would be capable of doing.
Honestly, this is one that I feel very conflicted about. While I do think that Phil did a great job in bringing back the microphone's name and telling a really good story, I don't know if I would rank it among his best work, and I don't listen to it as often as his other records. Okay, we're about halfway through the list and halfway through the video. Things are going great, but the sun is going to be going down very soon. I have a feeling that my electronic devices are going to run out of battery very, very quickly, and I have been sitting continuously and doing this for several hours now. So, with all that being said, I'm going to cut to me tomorrow to finish the rest of the video.
Thank you, me from yesterday. Now here is the top half of the list. Coming in at number 8 in the center of the ranking is Wind's Poem, Phil's equivalent to a black metal album. Being a black metal fan myself, I was quite excited to hear Wind's Poem, but I was also extremely concerned because this indie folk singer did not seem qualified to make a black metal album. Phil said that he intended to make his loudest album ever recorded, and he cited Zastor's Subliminal Genocide as well as the show Twin Peaks as influences on the music. He also denounced the record's black metal label, so I guess you can ignore everything I just said. I had reason to believe Wind's Poem was going to be a complete failure, but somehow it's good. Phil wasn't lying when he said this was going to be his loudest record, because it is overwhelmingly heavy. His vocals may be the same soft howling they've always been, but they are super low in the mix, so most of what you're hearing for the album's 55-minute runtime is insane amount of distortion. There are times that the layers of riffs and multi-tracked drums are so chaotic and cluttered that they just merge into a hellish wall of nothingness. This is most apparent on the opening song or the penultimate track, Lost Wisdom Part 2. That's really the only downside of the record. The mixes do get very overly crowded at times, feeling more uncomfortable than powerful. But the times that Phil chooses to show some restraint in the instrumentation are far and away the best moments on Wind's Poem. There are songs like Through the Trees, where instead of being pummeled with distortion, we are slowly greeted by these expansive, flowing synth chords. The creative synth arrangement, combined with some actually audible drums and very pretty vocals, makes for arguably the strongest moment on the record. And the middle section of the album is dominated by these very calm and atmospheric ballads. Those two are very well put together. Wind's Poem comes in the middle of my list because Phil's decision to make an album of subtly synthesized lo-fi epics, bookended with tracks packed with metal-influenced madness, is very strange. Regardless, I think it is a successful venture into darker sonic territories, and I would recommend it to fans of Phil's heavier and noisier sound. No Flashlight may have been Phil's first album without the input of the microphones, but a large majority of the record still sounds very similar to a Microphones album. That's not a bad thing, though. The album is pretty great. No Flashlight is probably the most quintessentially Phil album that Phil has ever made. While the ice-cold vocals and bare acoustics of Dawn, or the scattered noise folk of The Glow, also represent a trademark sound, I think that this was the moment that Phil unapologetically embraced the lo-fi production, lyrical nature obsession, and signature distortion that have come to make a Mount Eerie album a Mount Eerie album. It's very short, coming in at a brisk 37 minutes, making it one of the shortest records Phil has made thus far. This means that a lot of the 15 tracks are very brief, feeling more like a series of interludes. In the relatively brief runtime, though, the songs are amazing, even if they do get cut short a bit too soon. No Flashlight is all about the drums, and the drum work on this record is marvelous. The rhythm section has a very rough and homemade sound to it that only Phil could be capable of. Like, what other person could create a percussion section as dense and complex as the one on No Inside No Out using only their own hands? How does I Hold Nothing sound so sloppy yet so groovy at the same time? And how does the song What swing so heavy and yet still sound like a sad folk song? There are so many times the drums on this record just leave me asking, how did he do that? There's a reason that he released a separate record with just the drums. They're a force to be reckoned with on their own, that are only made even better when put in the context of the full album. Lyrically speaking, it's a bit harder to follow than a lot of his records. The lyrics seem to reflect on a lot of things: love, depression, death. There's also an introspective look at Phil's own music, like on the opening song where he says he's trying to write these songs and explain what Mount Eerie means, but he fears that no one is listening. With No Flashlight, Phil chose to abandon the expansive concept records of the microphones and make his first solo outing a short and intimate examination of his own current mental state. This leads to a record that proves how very early into his solo career, Phil was working on new lyrical themes and production techniques to make his solo discography as unique and individual as he possibly could. If I'm being completely honest, the early work of the microphones was mostly pretty forgettable. I know that sounds really harsh, but the tracks from Don't Wake Me Up and the band's early demos didn't really have a big impact on music. All of that changed when the band released their sophomore record, It Was Hot We Stayed in the Water. Now, the band's positive reception would skyrocket a year later when they released The Glow, but this was the first time that people really realized this band had something special. The vast improvements began with this album being recorded on a much higher budget. Gone are the dusty 4-track tape recorders and lo-fi tape splicing. Instead, they actually recorded it in a studio. This meant the band made a record that was a lot more organized and high quality than their previous material. The guitars are bright and vibrant, the professionally recorded vocals are as clear and resonant as ever, and the drums are otherworldly throughout this entire album, especially on the song Drums. So the band already had a lot going for them now that they cleaned up their production. On top of all that, the record is excellently written. The riffs are very pleasant, the vocal harmonies are gorgeously arranged, and, best of all, this was Phil's first venture into the signature nature-themed storytelling that would come to define the rest of his work. Phil's lyrics here explore themes of love and the introduction of the glow. Now, the glow is described as the indescribable feeling that makes one person special unlike anyone else. That concept is referenced all throughout the album, but it's most prominent on the song The Glow, an 11-minute epic explaining the feeling and what it does to Phil. It is easily my favorite song on the record, especially since it contains most of the album's lyrics. Yes, It Was Hot is another one that contains a lot of instrumental tracks, but they are a lot more controlled and reasonable here, lasting a maximum of 3 minutes, and containing enough variety and brilliant writing to make up for the lack of lyrics. Everything happening on It Was Hot is great, and the fact that the band was making such vast improvements to their sound that early into their career was a sign of great things to come in the future. Kicking off the top 5 is Lost Wisdom, released in 2008 as a collaboration with musicians Julie Doiron and Frederick Squire. While the album contained material that would also appear on the album Dawn, the two are drastically different albums, so it is important that one is not considered to be a subset of the other. Phil uses his guest vocalists very sparingly, so I was surprised to hear that he would be making an album that was entirely devoted to collaborative recordings. I was also surprised to see him making an album that is under 25 minutes long. Luckily, this record is a success in every way possible, and the addition of Julie and Frederick to the lineup makes it all the more powerful. Now, a lot of the things I like about Lost Wisdom could also be applied to Dawn. There is the cold, wintry atmosphere that makes every song very intimate and chilling. There is the nature-embracing production that captures the sounds of the trio surrounding as they perform. And there is the devastating, heartbreak-inspired songwriting. These are all now considered trademarks of Phil's musical style, and I'll talk about those a lot more in the Dawn segment. Like I said, a lot of the songs also appear on Dawn. But the biggest highlight of Lost Wisdom is Julie Doiron herself. I will admit I was not familiar with her work before going into this album, but now I understand why she was chosen to record it.
This woman's voice is hypnotic and calming and warm. Just listening to her sing feels like a musical hug. Take, for example, the opening title track, which is, in my opinion, one of the best songs Phil has ever recorded. The first thing we hear on the album is, of course, Phil, and he is a beautiful singer. But then Julie comes in, and I'm just swept away in this wave of sonic bliss. Hearing Phil's soft baritone vocals counteracted with alto harmonies is a next-level kind of experience. This is also the case on the song Voice in Headphones, with layers of harmonies from both Phil and Julie repeating the chorus of Björk's Undo. Hearing the duo interpolate one of my favorite Björk songs was really nice, but it wasn't just a wasted homage to Vespertine. It actually really works with the song's lyrics, and both of their voices sound flawless. Lost Wisdom also sees the acoustic instrumentation accompanied by Julie's electric guitars. The combination of two very different voices, alongside two very different guitars, continues the balance of contrasting themes that makes Lost Wisdom so exhilarating. Yeah, I just love this album. All three people involved are magnificent. And the fact that this album is so short but so riveting, and it only places at number 5, is a true testament to how impeccable Phil's discography really is.
Mount Eerie for many years was the final album by the Microphones, after which Phil would go on to use Mount Eerie as the name for his solo project. While it is very high on this list, and I love it very, very much, it is by far Phil's most daunting and inaccessible album. Yes, he did make a 45-minute acoustic song and an album influenced by black metal, but this was the moment where he fully embraced his experimental status and created something that is as astonishing as it is unusual. For that reason, I don't recommend it for a first-time listener, but it is still a wonderful album that you should definitely listen to. Mount Eerie is a sort of companion album to The Glow Part 2 that uses a lot of the same lyrical and musical themes to continue the story that The Glow was telling. This thing is 5 songs, each marked with a chapter and a one-word title, and the songs last anywhere between 3 and 17 minutes. Yes, Chapter 1 is 17 minutes long, 10 of which are devoted to drums. Mount Eerie is Phil's most complex and extravagant concept record thus far, detailing his climb up the titular mountain and encountering characters along the way, such as his inside voice, the Big Black Cloud, King Dark Death, and the Universe Choir, all of which are personifications of nature that cause him existential dread as he comes to terms with the fact that the universe is infinite and he is so small and unimportant. After a violent encounter with some vultures that essentially ends with him getting his soul consumed, Phil finds a home in the caves of Mount Eerie and comes to terms with the true infinity of the universe. This is a bizarre, surreal, and fantastical journey of an album told through noisy and disorienting music. Every time there appears to be a moment of calm or normalcy, Phil piles on tons of distortion, really strange vocal performances from other band members, and very dark lyrics about his inevitable death. But luckily, Mount Eerie isn't weird to be weird. This isn't another situation like with Ocean Roar, where Phil's attempts at being experimental could result in potential boredom. Here, the abnormal production and purely chaotic music exist not to disorient or scare off the listener, but to bring them closer to the fear that Phil experiences. This also applies to The Glow Part 2, but it works here very, very well. The additional vocals from other band members, like on the title track, could be seen as unnecessary, since Phil usually carries all vocal duties on a lot of his music. However, Phil could not properly portray all of these characters alone, and having every single member of the band represent the Big Black Cloud comes as a surprise to the listener, just as it does to Phil's character. What makes Mount Eerie so successful is it proves Phil can push musical boundaries while still making his work resonate with the listener, both as an autobiographical memoir or as a fantastical fictional story. While this record is a lot more excessive and self-indulgent than the one that preceded it, Mount Eerie, the temporary swan song for the Microphones, is a grandiose concept record that shows Phil is able to make something that is both crazy and absolutely beautiful. Is it just me, or is Dawn one of the greatest folk records ever made? Like, is that just me? Because this thing is awesome. I said earlier in the video that albums like Lost Wisdom Part 2 had all of this acoustic material dominating the runtime and not much to show for it in terms of quality lyrical content or an effective atmosphere. It's quite the opposite here. Dawn features some of Phil's most effective and touching songwriting to date. Dawn was recorded using the classic indie folk formula. Following a very harsh breakup, Phil isolated himself in a Norwegian cabin during the winter of 2002, in which he recorded this album. He also kept a series of journals and drawings that would go on to accompany the physical release. You can tell that this was definitely recorded during the winter when Phil was very, very sad, because every word is hushed and fragile. The guitar sounds like they're being plucked with ice-cold strings, and the lyrics are unabashedly depressed throughout all 19 of these tracks. Dawn is definitely a breakup album, but it's done in some of the most Phil ways possible. It explores traditional themes of loneliness, loss, despair, self-isolation. That's fine. But what makes Dawn stand out so much is how it all ties back to nature and Phil's surroundings in the cabin. Songs like Cold Mountain, Dead of Night, and sees Phil pondering death and feelings of unworthiness by exploring the nature around him and wishing to be consumed by the dark sides of nature. The stories of nature combined with the knowledge of Phil's isolation in the cabin makes a lot of these songs sound almost autobiographical, and that makes it really unsettling considering how broken and even suicidal some of these songs are. The other thing that makes Dawn so impressive to me takes some explaining, and it's kind of a reach, but you'll notice it when you listen to the album. I'm more interested in what Phil doesn't do on this album, and a lot of the palpable atmosphere of the record comes from silence. The cold and dead and lifeless feeling of Dawn is made even stronger when you factor in how all of the album is either very quiet or completely silent. Dawn requires high volumes and careful listening, and having the gaps in the songs filled with heavy breathing, string buzz, and the sounds from the cabin around him gives all these songs a very intimate and close feeling. Also, the endings of the songs are often prolonged to be completely silent for anywhere from 5 to 30 seconds, and being forced to sit quietly with Phil's words still resonating in our mind is such a gripping experience. Dawn may contain Phil's most rudimentary compositions, but the dense, despondent songwriting, combined with the intense winter atmosphere dominated by silence, makes for what could be Phil's most unsettling album and definitely one of his best. I guess now I have to talk about A Crow Looked at Me. Now, this is my second favorite album Phil has made, and it's one of my personal favorite albums I've ever heard, even though I can hardly bring myself to listen to it. In fact, since its initial release in 2017, I've only listened to the album 3 times. One when it was first published, one when I bought the vinyl, and the last was when I was going back through his discography to research for this video. On each of these occasions, I was dreading listening to the album, not for fear of being disappointed, but because this subject matter and these lyrics are extremely hard to listen to. A Crow Looked at Me was written, recorded, and released in the months following the death of Phil's wife. I was shocked to hear that he had a whole album worth of material ready so quickly after her death, but when I listened to the album, it became abundantly clear that Phil needed to make this record.
The 11 songs on this album are a collection of stories detailing the timeline of his wife's illness, her death, and the unbearable grief that Phil experienced as a result. That's literally the whole album. Devastating songs about death and how it hurts people. There is not a glimmer of hope, not a moment of optimism, not a second of relief. With this album, we are subjected to 41 minutes of suffering, being guided through the horrific abyss of grief with songs that are both brilliant in their performance and terrifying in their unabashed realism. I guess since I'm trying to explain why this is my second favorite Phil album, I will say this: A Crow Looked at Me does not falter once. The instrumentals, though bare and uncomplicated, are terrific, with enough variety and dynamics to keep them from getting too repetitive. Phil's vocals are stunning, somehow managing to carry a beautiful tune when reciting these painful lyrics. The album is incredibly consistent, with no filler tracks and empty spaces in the runtime. Look, I'm done trying to explain this from a critical standpoint. That's not why the album was made. That's not what I want. That's probably not what Phil wants. That's not why it exists. This album exists to show you that death is real. Phil says it multiple times in the lyrics because that is basically the moral of the album. A Crow Looked at Me is the sound of experiencing loss firsthand, a brutal and intimate portrait of what a person's death does to the living. Musically speaking, it is completely flawless, but the real reason that I put it so high on the list is because what Phil made here will go down in history as one of the most vulnerable and powerful albums ever to exist. I would say it's the most powerful album Phil has made, but there is one album that managed to surpass it. Yes, indeed, I do believe The Glow Part 2 is Phil's greatest album. This was the Microphones at their creative peak, and although it is a very experimental and emotionally tolling album, there is enough catchiness in the songwriting and traditional musical elements to make an album that is highly accessible despite its many strange elements. It is an album of stories, motifs, and repetitions that explores the loss of love and the subsequent pain it causes. I feel like The Glow explores grief in a way that is a lot more confident and level-headed than what Phil usually creates. There are 3 specific reasons why this is, in my opinion, Phil's greatest work. The first is Phil's decision to intentionally make the album as disorganized as possible as a way of tying the instrumental styles back to the lyrical themes. What we have here is Phil's perfect musical balance. It is an album that establishes, incorporates, and predicts every single sound Phil would use throughout his discography, and effortlessly combines all of his compositional tendencies. That's not to say it's bad to have an album that sticks to one sound. As you saw early in the video, I loved the consistently hellish winds poem, or the cold, morbid atmosphere of Dawn. But what sets The Glow apart is Phil is able to create a tangible atmosphere because of how unstable the music is. The constant changing in styles that remain grounded in themes of fear and anxiety allow him to explore tons of sonic territory and enhance the album's concept instead of losing it. So the first reason was Phil is able to use the instruments as a way of connecting to the themes and the lyrics. And the second reason is those lyrics are Phil's greatest ever written. Take, for example, the first 2 tracks. I Want Wind to Blow starts the album with an acoustic song, and Phil sings about his desire for change and something to happen. He's sick of the stillness and silence, and he wants something to happen. He wants wind to blow. And then it transitions perfectly into the title track, where Phil gets exactly what he wants, in a sudden burst of noise rock chaos. The instrumentation of the title track is built on a series of keyboard drones, just like the first song from It Was Hot We Stayed in the Water, until the song ends super suddenly, signaling that the glow is indeed gone. We're only 2 songs into the album, and we can already tell that he made this very, very carefully. Normally, super sudden song endings and constant changes in style would be a downfall, but Phil's ability to take these wild shifts and connect them back to the story and the lyrics is masterfully executed, and it makes the album so dynamic and satisfying. The third and final reason is the aforementioned concept of the album. Phil knows how to make a great concept record, with both The Glow and the follow-up Mount Eerie simultaneously capturing an autobiographical and a fictional story at the same time. Now, the plot of The Glow Part 2 may not be very obvious on a first listen, but once you read the lyrics, you'll realize that it is actually a magnificent story of heartache, loss, and death. To summarize my arguments, I believe that the intentionally chaotic instrumental choices, the poignant and detailed songwriting, and the marvelous linear storyline lead to a groundbreaking and, at least for me, a life-changing album that is the definitive portrayal of pain through music. With The Glow, Phil channels every single one of his negative emotions into a brilliant and iconic musical statement that forces the listener to feel every ounce of pain and sorrow with him and join him on a musical journey to turn that pain into something that is overwhelmingly beautiful.
Thus ends my ranking of Phil Elverum's 15 studio albums from worst to best. Thank you so much for listening, and maybe leave your own list in the comments if you have a different ranking. Remember, opinions change, opinions disagree, and that is totally okay. My next video will be about a topic I am so excited to discuss. I will be making a video detailing the history, the discography, and the evolution of Young Lean. This man has had a huge impact on the world of rap music, and his very peculiar discography, combined with an enigmatic reputation and a fascinating backstory, leads to him being one of the most important rappers today. I will be talking about his life and his work in my next video. And that's the end of the video. As always, remember to like and subscribe if you feel so inclined, follow my other social media profiles for more content every day, And give my new EP a listen. I think you'll like it. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you all have a very nice day.